I never thought that a simple message on a dating app would drive me to the brink of madness. But there I was, in front of the house that promised an unforgettable night, completely oblivious to the terror that awaited me. Upon arriving, the first thing I noticed was the silence, a silence so dense that it seemed to have weight. Elena's house stood imposingly in front of me, its stone walls weathered by time, and its tall windows darkened as if they held secrets of the past. Despite the bright afternoon sun, a shiver ran down my spine as I crossed the threshold. It was as if each step toward the front door drew me deeper into a cold, elongated shadow, slowly devouring the warmth of the day. Elena greeted me with a nervous smile, which did little to hide the trembling of her hands. "It's an old family home," she explained as she led me down the narrow hallway, the walls of which were adorned with portraits of people who seemed to be watching me with eerie intensity. "I hope you don't mind the isolation. Sometimes it's a little intense in here." As I followed in their footsteps, I couldn't help but feel that something in the atmosphere was askew. The house, with its rooms that seemed too large and its hallways too narrow, seemed designed not only to confuse, but to conceal. It was as if every corner was permeated with a hushed whisper, waiting for the right moment to make itself heard. As the day faded and the sky took on shades of orange and red, the air inside the house cooled, making me remember Elena's unspoken warnings. "The house can be a little noisy at night," she said with a forced laugh as we sat down in the dining room for dinner. Despite the crackling fire in the fireplace, the chill seeped through every crack, every crevice. After dinner, Elena suggested we explore a bit. "There are parts of this house that even I don't know well," she confessed. With candle in hand, we began to wander through the rooms. In one of them, filled with old books and documents, Elena stopped in front of a bookshelf. Her gaze fixed on a point behind the books. There was something that made her uneasy. With a determined gesture, she removed several dusty tomes, revealing a small door hidden behind. "I've never seen this before," she murmured in a trembling voice. We pushed open the door, which creaked ominously as it opened, and found a small, dreary room. In the center, a desk covered with papers and an old, worn diary. I opened it carefully, and the words written in shaky handwriting spoke of rituals, family secrets, and a spirit to be appeased. The last entry was dated several decades ago, but the words seemed to scream from the page, full of fear and warning. As we read, the sounds began. First, it was barely a murmur, as if someone was whispering in a distant room. Then, thumps, as of something heavy crawling through the halls. Elena blanched. "This shouldn't be happening," she said. This isn't normal here." The shadows seemed to grow larger, stretching toward us like cold hands. Each noise increased our fear, and the atmosphere was charged with a sense of impending disaster. "We must finish what was started," Elena murmured, pointing to the journal. The page marked a ritual, something her ancestor had attempted and failed to complete. There, surrounded by shadows and whispers, with the only light of our candle flickering as if fighting the darkness itself, we decided to try to close the circle that had been opened so long ago. Little did we know, that decision would lead to a night of revelations and terror that neither of us could have anticipated. We armed ourselves with everything the journal indicated was necessary for the ritual. Black candles, a circle of salt, and a strange symbol drawn on the ground with charcoal. The air became thick, almost palpable, as we prepared each item with trembling hands. Elena recited words in a language I did not recognize, her voice a whisper that echoed strangely off the walls of the dark room. The noises intensified, now becoming a chorus of moans and creaks that seemed to emanate from the very structure of the house. With every word Elena uttered, a response seemed to emerge from the shadows, as if the house itself was reacting, writhing. "Something is wrong!" I shouted above the growing tumult, but Elena was absorbed in her task, her eyes fixed on the open journal in front of her. An icy wind began to blow into the room, despite there being no open windows. The candles were fluttering violently, threatening to be extinguished. Just as Elena uttered the last word of the ritual, a dull rumble shook the house, as if something very heavy had fallen on the ceiling. The room went completely dark for a moment, and then a cold, whitish light emerged from the circle of salt. A shadowy figure, barely denser than the surrounding darkness, formed in front of us. It had no defined features, but its presence was overwhelming, filling the space with an indescribable terror. "Elena, what do we do now?" My voice was a thread of pure fear. "I don't know," she replied, her voice cracking with panic. "This shouldn't be happening. The ritual was supposed to placate it, not invoke it." The figure moved, or rather glided toward us. Its presence was paralyzing. I felt as if every part of my body wanted to flee, but I was hopelessly fixed in place. Elena backed up until she was against the wall, her eyes never leaving the form that stalked us. It was then that I understood that something had gone terribly wrong with her family's previous attempts to seal this spirit. We were not appeasing a curse. We were confronting the pent-up anger of generations, now released without restraint. In an act of desperation, Elena grabbed the journal and hurled it toward the shadowy figure, while reciting another string of words in that strange language. The figure stopped, as if intercepted by an invisible blow, and a howl that seemed neither human nor of this world filled the room, vibrating in our bones. The light began to fade slowly, and the figure dissolved like smoke in the cold air. The last vestige of light was extinguished with a final sigh, leaving us in a darkness that felt, for the first time that night, empty of threat. We fell silent. The only sound was our ragged breathing. Elena slid to the floor, her shoulders shaking with each sob. "It's done," she finally said. "But at what cost?" Dawn found us still in that room, exhausted and surrounded by the chaos of a nightly ritual. We didn't know if what we had done would be enough to keep the spirit at bay in the future, or if we had simply won a temporary truce. But one thing was certain: our lives would never be the same after that night in the house that promised an unforgettable night, but for very different reasons than expected. As the first rays of sunlight timidly filtered through the dirty windows, illuminating the traces of the previous night's chaos, the silence between us lengthened. There was nothing to say. Words seemed trivial in the face of the enormity of what we had experienced. We rose slowly, moving with the stiffness of those who have spent a night fighting more than darkness. Elena picked up the journal, now open at the last page written by her ancestor. With trembling hands, she closed it and held it to her chest, as if it were a fragile shield against the horrors that could still lurk in the unlit corners of the house. "We must make sure this doesn't happen again," she said in a broken voice, more to herself than to me. Her gaze swept around the room, lingering on every shadow as if it might come to life at any moment. We left the room, the weight of our footsteps echoing in the silence like an echo of the night's events. As we walked down the hallway toward the exit, each shadow seemed less threatening in the growing daylight, but the memory of the past night permeated every corner, every crack in the walls. As we crossed the threshold of the house, the fresh morning air seemed a balm to our weary souls. Elena paused and looked back at the house that had been her home and her prison. "Maybe it's time to leave this place," she murmured. "No happy memories can survive the shadows we have unleashed and re-imprisoned here." We parted in silence, each taking with us not only the memories of a night of terror, but the heavy burden of a secret we should keep. As I drove away, I took one last look at the house, wondering if peace would ever be possible in a place with so many dark stories anchored to its foundation. On the way back, my mind toyed with the possibility of sharing this story, but every time the idea came up, a voice inside me whispered about the responsibility of keeping silent, about the danger of unearthing what should remain hidden. So, in the end, I decided to keep this experience to myself, a dark memory of a night where the past and its horrors manifested all too real. Nevertheless, the shadows of that night never left me completely. Sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I feel the echo of those ancient whispers, and I know that even though the door is closed, there is always something waiting patiently to be released again. So, as I sit in front of the screen to tell this story, it is with the hope that it is just that, a story, and a silent plea for the shadows of Elena's house to remain where they belong, behind closed doors and in forgotten pages of a worn-out diary.